The tent held 10,000 people, and every single one of them was on their feet. It was 1952, somewhere in rural Ontario, and the August heat had turned the canvas walls into something close to an oven. People had driven from Sudbury, from Timmins, from small towns that didn't even appear on most maps. They had come in trucks with cracked windshields and station wagons, packed with children. They had come on faith, or something close enough to it that the difference didn't matter yet. And at the front of that tent, a man with no seminary degree, no family name anyone recognized, no denomination willing to claim him, stood with his hands raised and his voice cutting through the heat like something alive. His name was Oliver Bryce Farwell, and 10 years before that night in Ontario, he had been lying face down in a drainage ditch outside of Winnipeg, certain he was going to die there, and not particularly troubled by the idea. People who knew Oliver as a child would tell you later that there had always been something restless in him. Not wild, exactly. Not dangerous, just restless, like a current running underneath still water. He was born in the winter of 1918 in a farmhouse outside of Brandon, Manitoba, the third of 5 children. His father, a man of few words and fewer expressions, worked a grain farm that gave back just enough to make quitting feel impossible. His mother was a woman who sang hymns while she worked, who kept a worn King James Bible on the kitchen table, who believed with a quietness that never needed to announce itself. Oliver watched her. He watched the way she prayed without performance, the way she talked about God, the way other people talked about someone they had actually met. He found it curious and slightly embarrassing, in the way that children find their parents' deepest convictions embarrassing. He did not share it. He was not sure he wanted to. He was a decent student, quick with numbers, good at reading, the kind of boy teachers noted without quite knowing what to make of. At 16, he took a job at a hardware store in Brandon. At 18, he left for Winnipeg, carrying a cardboard suitcase, and the absolute certainty that his life was about to become something larger than a grain farm in Manitoba. It didn't. Not immediately, not for a long time. Winnipeg in the late 1930s had work if you weren't particular about what kind. Oliver was not particular. He loaded freight. He swept factory floors. He drove delivery trucks through winters that cracked the skin on his knuckles and fogged the windshield from inside. He was not unhappy, exactly, but he was not anything else either. He was just moving, through rooms, through jobs, through evenings in establishments his mother would not have approved of, through friendships that lasted until they didn't. The drinking started gradually, the way it always does. A drink at the end of a shift, because the shift had been long. A drink at the start of a weekend because the weekend had arrived. Then a drink in the middle of a Tuesday afternoon, because the distinction between Tuesday and Saturday had stopped meaning much. By 1940 he was 22 years old, and his restlessness had curdled into something heavier. He had no particular direction, no particular faith, no particular reason to stop drinking. He had a room in a boarding house on Portage Avenue, where the landlady knocked on the door every Friday for rent, and he sometimes had it and sometimes didn't. He did not think of himself as a man in trouble. That was perhaps the most dangerous part. The drainage ditch outside Winnipeg happened in the autumn of 1941. He had been drinking for 3 days straight, a stretch of time that had lost its shape somewhere around the second day and become simply continuous. He didn't remember leaving the city. He didn't remember how he got where he was. He came to consciousness on his back in a shallow ditch along a farm road, looking up at a sky so full of stars it seemed almost aggressive. He was cold in the specific way that tells the body something is wrong. His hands weren't working properly. He had lost one of his boots somewhere. He lay there for what might have been an hour. He thought, with the peculiar clarity that sometimes arrives at the edges of catastrophe, that this was where it ended. Not dramatically, not even particularly tragically. Just here in a ditch, in Manitoba at 23 years old with one boot, he said. And he told this story hundreds of times in the years that followed, and the details never changed, which is either evidence of its truth or evidence of how thoroughly he had come to need it. He said that lying there in that ditch, with the stars overhead and his hands not working, he felt something he could not name. Not a voice, not a vision. Something more like a pressure or a question, or the sense of being seen by something that was not going to look away. He said he started to cry. He said he hadn't cried since he was a boy and wasn't sure he still knew how, but apparently he did. He said the words that came out of him weren't a prayer, exactly, because he didn't know how to pray. They were more like a man at the end of himself, saying so. I don't know how to do this. I don't know how to be this. If there's anything else, I'm listening. A farmer found him at dawn, pulled him out of the ditch, gave him a ride into the nearest town, and asked no questions that Oliver can remember. Oliver got on a bus back to Winnipeg. He walked into his boarding house, went to his room, and did not touch a drink again for the rest of his life. He would say later, I didn't stop drinking because I had willpower. I stopped because something had been exchanged in that ditch, and I didn't fully understand what, but I knew the drinking was part of what I was giving away. The following months were quiet and strange. He found a job at a machine shop. He started going to a small Pentecostal church on a side street, not because he felt compelled to, or even particularly welcomed, but because as it was the only place he knew where people talked about God the way his mother had, like someone they had actually met. He sat in the back. He listened. He was not, in those early months, a man anyone would have noticed. He was simply a man in a machine shop uniform, sitting in the back of a church, trying to figure out what had happened to him in a ditch. The pastor, an older man named Reverend Coburn, quiet and deliberate, noticed him eventually the way certain pastors notice people who are genuinely searching rather than simply attending. He invited Oliver for coffee. He answered questions without impatience. He gave Oliver a Bible and suggested he start with the Gospel of John, not Genesis, which Oliver would later say was the most practically useful piece of advice he ever received. Something opened in him that winter. He could not have described it precisely. He would try later, in front of thousands of people, and the words were never quite adequate, which he said was the point. If you could fully describe it, it probably wasn't the thing. He began to pray in the way his mother had prayed. He began to fast, sometimes for days. He began to feel that the restlessness he had carried all his life was not a defect but a direction, and that he had simply been running it the wrong way. He was 23 years old. He had a grade 10 education, no money, no theological training, and no connections in any church structure that might have opened a door. He had, as far as anyone could observe, absolutely nothing that qualified him for what was about to happen. The first time Oliver prayed for someone's healing, he did not intend to. It was 1943. He had been helping out at a small prayer meeting in a church basement in Winnipeg, setting up chairs, making coffee, the kind of work that doesn't require credentials. When a woman came in supporting her husband, who had been suffering from a condition affecting his spine for years. He walked with 2 canes. He was visibly in pain. Oliver does not appear to have been consulted. One of the older women at the prayer meeting simply gestured to him and said, "Oliver, come pray for this man." He said afterward that he felt entirely unprepared and not remotely qualified and fairly certain nothing was going to happen. He prayed anyway. He put his hands on the man's shoulders, and he prayed with the only thing he actually had, which was the memory of that ditch and the sense that whatever had met him there was real. The man walked out of that church basement without his canes. Oliver went home and sat in his room for a long time. He did not announce what had happened. He did not go back to the prayer meeting that week and declare himself an instrument of divine healing. He sat with it, the way a man sits with something he doesn't yet have language for. He prayed, he fasted, he waited. But people talked. In small church communities, things like this travel. Within weeks, he was being asked to pray for others. Within months, he was driving to churches in small towns outside Winnipeg on weekends, not as a featured speaker, not as anything official, just as Oliver Farwell, who had something people could not quite name but wanted to be near. By 1946, what had started as weekend visits to small churches had become something that required more than a machine shop salary could sustain. He left the job. He left Winnipeg. He began traveling. This is the part of the story where, if you were inclined to skepticism, you would note the absence of accountability, the lack of institutional structure, the ease with which a charismatic man could gather followings in rural communities hungry for the extraordinary. That skepticism is not wrong. It is a reasonable thing to bring to this, but it is also worth noting what the record actually shows. Oliver Farwell, in those first years of traveling ministry, kept meticulous notes of every meeting, not because anyone asked him to, because he felt accountable to something larger than any audience. He recorded healings that he could document, and was careful, sometimes painfully careful, to note when he could not verify a claimed healing. He published accounts of meetings where nothing visibly miraculous occurred. He wrote, in a newsletter he sent to supporters, "I will not manufacture what God has not given. If he moves, I will report it. If he doesn't, I will say so. I would rather have a congregation of 10 people who are telling the truth than 10,000 people repeating what they want to believe." This was not a popular position in some of the revival circles he moved through. There were evangelists in that era, and he knew some of them, who ran their meetings like theater, who had cues and staging and arrangements that the people in the audience didn't know about. Oliver refused that. He refused it loudly, sometimes when he felt the refusal needed to be loud. This made him enemies. It also made him something rarer, trusted. The tent arrived in 1949. He had no money for it. He had, in fact, no logical way of acquiring it. He had been traveling for 3 years, sleeping in spare rooms and church basements, driving a truck with a transmission that had been problematic since 1947. He had a mailing list of supporters that numbered in the hundreds, not thousands. He prayed about the tent for 6 months. He told people he was going to have a tent that could seat 8,000 people. People who knew him well and loved him received this announcement with careful supportive expressions that did not quite conceal their private concern. The tent arrived through a sequence of events that Oliver could never tell without laughing. A canceled order from a traveling circus, a connection through a man he had met at a truck stop in Saskatchewan, a price that was exactly what he had managed to accumulate over those 6 months of saving. He set it up for the first time outside of Regina. 1,200 people came to the first night. By the third night, they were standing outside the canvas. He was 31 years old. The years that followed were the years that people remembered. The tent went up in towns across Ontario, Saskatchewan, Manitoba, British Columbia, and eventually into parts of the United States. Newspapers covered him, sometimes admiringly, and sometimes not. A Toronto paper ran a piece in 1951 that was specifically constructed to find holes in the healing accounts. The reporter attended 3 meetings, interviewed several people who claimed to have been healed, and concluded, with evident surprise, that he could not locate any evidence of fraud. This was not the story the reporter had expected to write. The denominations were watching. Some of them were watching with interest. Some of them were watching with the specific kind of wariness that institutions reserve for movements they cannot control. Oliver had never been formally affiliated with any denomination, which some saw as freedom and others saw as accountability avoided. He was not invited to certain conferences. He was not given certain platforms. He did not particularly mind, which was either admirable or maddening depending on your position. What he did, increasingly, was focus on 2 things that he felt were being neglected in the revival culture around him: prayer and the poor. He prayed long after everyone else had gone to bed. This was documented not by Oliver, but by the people who traveled with him. The small team of assistants and drivers and co-workers who watched him go into his tent or his room after a service that had already lasted 3 hours, and who would walk past at midnight and hear him still going. He slept perhaps 4 or 5 hours a night. He fasted weekly. He said that the source of whatever power moved through him had nothing to do with him, and everything to do with the hours he put in when no one was watching. As for the poor, the healing meetings were free, always. No collection was taken during the service itself. People who had been brought in wheelchairs, people who had taken Greyhound buses because they couldn't afford cars, people who drove through the night from communities without hospitals. These were not charged for the ministry they received. Oliver was fierce about this in a way that occasionally made his supporters uncomfortable, given that the tent and the truck and the mailing list all cost money. He fundraised. He was not shy about fundraising. But the line between fundraising and the ministry of healing was one he would not cross. The trouble with the churches came to a head in 1953. It was not a single incident. It was the accumulation of incidents, of Oliver's refusal to filter what he said through what was institutionally acceptable, of his habit of calling out practices he considered dishonest, even when the people he was calling out were larger and better funded than he was, of his willingness to pray for people from denominations that some of his Pentecostal colleagues considered, in various ways, insufficiently orthodox. A council of denominational leaders in Ontario wrote him a letter that was, in tone, something between a warning and an ultimatum. They had concerns about his theology, his methods, his accountability structures. They wanted him to come under the authority of a denominational board. Oliver responded in writing. The letter was 3 pages. It was, by accounts of people who read it, remarkably respectful in tone and completely immovable in substance. He said he welcomed accountability. He said he had always been accountable, to God, to the people he prayed for, and to the public record of his ministry, which anyone could examine. He said he could not accept the authority of a board that he believed was more concerned with controlling him than with the actual work. He was, at that point, running the largest independent healing ministry in Canada. The denominations did what institutions do when they cannot absorb something. They close their doors to it. Churches that had hosted his meetings stopped returning calls. Pastors who had been enthusiastic supporters became carefully unavailable. It was, by any reasonable assessment, a significant blow. Oliver kept going. He reduced the size of his team. He found different venues, community halls, fairgrounds, outdoor spaces where no church building was required. He was not bitter about the opposition, or at least he did not appear to be, which his closest associates said was one of the genuinely strange things about him. He simply noted in a newsletter from late 1953 that Jesus had not been particularly popular with the institutional religious leadership of his day either, and moved on. The meeting in Kapuskasing in the winter of 1955 was the one people talked about for decades afterward. Kapuskasing was not a large town. It was a mill town in northern Ontario, the kind of place that held together because the industry held it, and where the winters were serious enough to keep out anyone who was not there by necessity. Oliver had no particular reason to be there. He had been asked by a small group of people through a connection he no longer remembered, and he had come. The community hall held perhaps 300 people, and it was full. The evening had gone the way his evenings often went. Singing, prayer, testimony, the invitation to come forward. A woman came forward who had been deaf in her left ear since a childhood illness. Her name, he learned later, was Vivienne. She was in her 40s. She had brought her daughter, who stood slightly behind her with the careful watchfulness of someone who had learned to protect a parent from disappointment. Oliver prayed for her. There was nothing dramatic about the prayer. No theatrical gesture, no sustained performance. His associates said he grew very quiet just before he prayed for someone in that way. Like something had shifted in him. The woman's hand went to her ear. She stood very still for a moment. Then she looked at her daughter and said something. And the daughter's face changed in a way that people in that hall described, independently, in remarkably similar terms for the rest of their lives. Oliver did not announce what had happened. He moved on. He did not use the moment as a climax. People who attended his meetings said that this was one of the most unusual things about him, that he seemed almost uninterested in the moments themselves, as though the moments were not the point. The point, he said, was the people, not the miracles, the people. He was diagnosed in the spring of 1957. The irony was not lost on him, and he did not try to pretend it was. The diagnosis was a degenerative condition affecting the nerves. A condition that, in the years he had been traveling, he had seen claimed as healed in dozens of meetings. He had prayed for people with this diagnosis. He had documented cases he believed to be genuine healings of it. He was 39 years old. He told very few people at first. He continued his schedule, or a version of it. He reduced the travel. He wrote more. He spent longer in the early mornings sitting with his Bible and his coffee, which his associates attributed simply to age and the accumulation of miles, not knowing what they were actually watching. He wrote in his journal, which was published, after his death, by his family, with a consistency that never seemed to waver into self-pity, which is either an extraordinary achievement of character or evidence that he had worked something out with God that the rest of us haven't. He wrote about the question people would ask, eventually, why would a man who healed others not be healed himself? And he worked on the answer not as an apologist, but as a man genuinely sitting with a hard question. He wrote, "I don't think I was ever the source. I was a pipe, and a fairly bent one at that. The water that moved through me did the work. What happens to the pipe in the end is not the story. The water is the story." He wrote, Paul asked 3 times. The answer was no. The answer was, "My grace is sufficient." I have decided in these months that this is either the cruelest thing God ever said to a man. Some days it is the first. Most days. Now it is the second. His last public meeting was in the autumn of 1958 in a church in Hamilton, Ontario. He did not appear from the outside to be a man at the end of his ministry. He had lost weight. He moved more carefully. But his voice was what it had always been. Direct and without decoration, the voice of a man who had never fully shed his machine shop years. He prayed for people that evening, one at a time, in the way he always had. He did not speak about himself. He did not say that this was the last time. After the service, he sat with the pastor and his wife for a while, drinking tea and talking about nothing in particular. He laughed at something. One of the pastor's stories. They could never remember afterward exactly what the story was. Then he said good night, and he went to the room they had prepared for him, and he slept. He died the following March, in Winnipeg, in the city where it had all started, in the spring of 1959. He was 40 years old. The records he kept are in archives now. The newsletters, the meeting notes, the journal entries, the documented accounts of what happened in small churches and big tents and community halls across Canada and beyond. Researchers have gone through them. They are remarkably consistent. The man on paper is, as far as anyone can tell, the same man the people who knew him described. He did not get rich. He left almost nothing. The tent had long since been worn out and replaced and worn out again. The truck had given up somewhere in Saskatchewan in 1954 and been buried there, essentially. What he left was the record and the memory in the minds of people who were there. An older woman, interviewed decades later, described being brought to one of his meetings as a child by her grandmother. She said she did not remember what he said. She said what she remembered was the quality of the attention in the room. The sense that something was expected, that the people gathered genuinely believed they were in the presence of something real. She said, "He made us feel like faith was not something to be embarrassed about." She said, "He made us feel like the asking was allowed." There is a question that sits at the center of a life like Oliver Farwell's, and it is the question that people in those comment sections always circle back to, because it is the honest question, the question that doesn't go away when you close the video. If God healed, why did he die of the very thing he had prayed others out of? If the power was real, why couldn't he use it for himself? If faith that large couldn't protect him, what does that mean for the rest of us with our ordinary faith and our ordinary fears? He had an answer for this. Whether you find it adequate depends on where you're starting from. He said the question assumed that healing was the reward for the healed, when in his experience it was always a gift given through a person and aimed at something larger than the individual. He said Paul the Apostle had raised the dead and spent years in prison. He said Elijah had called fire down from heaven and then sat under a tree and asked to die. He said the presence of power in a life does not mean the absence of suffering. He said, in fact, that the two had rarely been separated in any story he found worth reading. He said, "If you're looking for evidence that God protects the faithful from all difficulty, you will not find it in Scripture, and you will not find it in my life. But if you're looking for evidence that something moves through ordinary and broken people and does what they cannot do themselves, I have 40 years of notebooks on that subject, and I am available to discuss it." He was, at the end, exactly what he had been in the beginning, a man from Brandon, Manitoba, with a grade 10 education and something he couldn't fully explain, who had decided that the inability to explain it was not a reason to stop. The tent held 10,000 people that August night in Ontario, and every one of them drove home through the dark, on roads that led back to ordinary lives, carrying something they had not arrived with, something they would spend years trying to name, without quite getting there, which Oliver would have said was exactly as it should be. Some things are not meant to be contained in words. They are meant to keep moving.